Okay, hello everybody. I want to offer greetings to our guests, our virtual audience, and of course, my fellow Lemkin Institute team members who are here. They are all volunteers and they do so much work to ensure that the Lemkin Institute can function. So I want to thank them all in advance. In particular, I want to thank our executive committee members, Lexi Poston and Leah Parila, as well as Emily Pogosian and Elisa Alexanian for the work they have put into bringing this event to life today. I am Elisa von Joeden-Forgey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. And I want to welcome everyone today to today's symposium, How to Identify Genocide, the Case of Ukraine. This is the first in a series of symposia we will be holding as part of our 2024 Year of Prevention initiative. And you can find all of our upcoming events as well as more about our Year of Prevention initiative at our website at www.lemkininstitute.com. Now, as everyone here probably knows, tomorrow will mark the 2-year anniversary of Russia's genocidal invasion of Ukraine. As this war continues, I think it becomes increasingly important that the world recognizes its genocidal dimensions, as it is in these dimensions that we see both the stakes, the very high stakes of this war, as well as the long-term harm that Russia is committing against Ukrainians and the Ukrainian identity. And this is a harm that is very hard, we know from previous genocides, to address through justice mechanisms, and other mechanisms, and therefore it needs to be recognized early on and addressed as quickly as possible. And so that's a challenge to all of us. The Lemkin Institute, along with many genocide scholars and many organizations, recognized the genocidal threat of Putin's invasion even before it happened. For us, in particular, it was Putin's own words that sent up red flags. His denial of the existence of Ukraine and of the Ukrainian identity closely follows pattern 9 of our 10 patterns of genocide, which is denial of identity. And it is this sort of ideological construct that is very closely associated with genocide. After the invasion, many of the war crimes committed by Russia demonstrated to us that Putin not only harbored genocidal intent, but also intended to implement this intent on the ground. And perhaps none of Russia's crimes are more clearly genocidal than its policy of forcibly transferring Ukrainian children to Russia for forcible adoption and forcible naturalization. We will discuss all of these things today with our panelists. So we are looking very, very forward to hearing from our guests how it is they came to conclude that Russia's actions in Ukraine were genocidal or constituted genocide, what they think we can learn from the Ukraine case about the identification of genocide going forward, and what can be done in the Ukraine case now to address this need to stop Russia's genocide. The case of Ukraine offers the world, I think, instructive lessons about genocide identification because so many organizations and scholars were quick to recognize the red flags, and even states who are generally very conservative in their use of the term genocide have stepped up to make the case. One of the things I hope that will come out of this discussion today is some ideas about how we can translate the readiness of at least the Western world to recognize genocidal red flags in Ukraine into more robust international institutions and mechanisms that would translate this readiness to global recognition initiatives. So without further ado, let's get started. We have 3 wonderful speakers here with us today. Dr. Gregory Stanton, the founding president of Genocide Watch, Kateryna Rashevska, a legal expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights in Ukraine, who is joining us from Kiev, and Dr. Emily Roche, a recent PhD from Boston University and a Lemkin Institute affiliated scholar. So we're so honored that all of you have joined us today. As you may notice, we also have a slight change in the program, as Michael Ceciri from the U.S. Helsinki Commission is unfortunately unable to be here with us today due to a family emergency. And we will certainly miss his insights. He sends his regrets, but we are sending him our best and will announce an event with him in the near future. We have about 1 hour for presentations today and about a half an hour to 20 minutes for questions and answers. So anyone in attendance, you're encouraged to write your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and our fabulous executive committee member, Lexi Poston, will be sure to ask them during the Q&A session. So I would like to start today's symposium with Dr. Stanton. As you all may know, Dr. Stanton, as I mentioned earlier, is the founding president of Genocide Watch. And, oh, hold on one second. I'm so sorry, but a page just disappeared for me. Hold on, I don't know what I did on my computer, but I want to read Dr. Stanton's bio correctly. So I apologize for this. Lexi, do you have that up?
Oh, you don't need it. Just tell
No.
them I 3 grand.
I don't know. I was reading, I was switching to it, and I think I minimized it, and now I can't find it again.
No,
Greg, will you do me a favor and introduce yourself? I'm so sorry.
sure. I think the most important thing, actually, in this particular symposium, is that back when I was a law professor at Washington and Lee, I got a call in the middle of the night once, and at the time I was the chair of the American Bar Association's Young Lawyers Division Human Rights Committee. And we had, in fact, confronted the ABA about its relationship with the Association of Soviet Lawyers, which was a communist organization. We said, we don't think this is particularly a good idea that you have this relationship. Anyway, I guess the word got around because I got this call in the middle of the night, and they said, we want you to be the lawyer for Ivan Makar. And I said, who's Ivan Makar? Well, it turns out this was 1998. They said, well, no, 1988. They said, he's one of our independence leaders. And I said, how can I represent him? I mean, I'm not a member of the Ukrainian Bar Association. And they said, don't worry about that. We'll take care of that. Not that you become a member. We want an international campaign to get him out of prison. And I said, oh, well, gosh, we can help you with that. And so we, launched a campaign using Radio Free Europe and all these various and sundry media and pressure from governments and stuff. And sure enough, they did release him. But then the Soviets got very serious, and they started arresting a lot of the independence leaders. And so I started to work, on that. And the Free Congress Committee here in the United States and Ukrainian Congress Committee of America asked me to actually go to Ukraine to help them with tactics of, they knew I had been trained in the civil rights movement here in the United States. I'd been trained, in fact, by Martin Luther King himself. And what they wanted was to bring some of the techniques of the nonviolent resistance of that movement to Ukraine. So I went. And I remember when Yuri Asvasian, who was the lawyer for the RUK, the independence movement, said, it's okay, Professor, what should we do? And I said, first of all, you have to always personalize the injustice. Make sure they know a person is affected by it. And so what we're going to do first is we're going to go down to the prison. This is the very prison where Lenin had been held. And we're going to ask to see the people that they have arrested. And that included Stefan Kamara, who's one of the leaders, and 14 others who were there in that prison. I said, I promise you they won't let us see them, but then we're going to come back and we will have a huge rally here in the middle of Kyiv. And So they organized that. 5,000 people were at that rally. And we did have that big rally. And there were speeches. And the president, by the way, of the RUK, the independence movement, was the most accomplished poet in Ukraine. And he was my secret weapon, because whenever they asked me to speak, I'd write some speech, and then hand it over to the translator that they had for me. And then he would take it to this president of the RUK, who would translate it into poetry. So, the people would go wild by the time. It was wonderful, of course. Those days, I saw the courage of the Ukrainian people. I saw why they would win, why, in fact, the Soviet Union would fall. And by 1991, it did fall, as you know. And I stood there in the Maidan with Stepan Gamara, one of the independence movement leaders, and watched them take down the 80-foot tall statue of Vladimir Lenin, 80 feet tall, block by granite block. It was one of the most thrilling moments of my life. Now, that independence is again threatened by the very same KGB and very same Soviet ideology, really, and Russian nationalist imperialism that was present in 1988 and 1991. And so we see now that Russia again is trying to conquer Ukraine. And in answering the question that Elisa asked us to answer today, I want to take you through the reasoning that we saw immediately, as she did, why this was genocide and why it would be genocide. So what I want to do is take you through the steps that Genocide Watch looks at when it's trying to warn about genocide. So let's go through them. They're really not that hard to understand. In fact, one of the reasons our model has become so popular is because it's simple. People can actually remember it. And it has to be like that for you to get to policymakers, to have teachers use it, and so forth. And that's why, and by the way, it's not unscientific at all, because it's based on fundamental transformations in cultures. And that's why each of these words that we use is a transformation word. It talks about a transformation in the culture. And these are fundamental operations, in fact, in every culture. So let's go through the model, and we'll take a look at why we saw this as immediately that it was going to be genocide. First of all, as Elisa's already said, there was this rejection of Ukraine as a separate nation from Russia, and that is classification. What they were doing is denying classification. They were saying Russia includes Ukraine. And in fact, they put it very vividly in an article that was published that was called, "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?" It was published April 3rd, 2022, by a Russian state-owned media outlet that said, and I'm quoting, "Ukraine is impossible as a nation state, and its very name likely cannot be retained. The Ukrainian nationalist elite need to be liquidated." That kind of definition of classification is why you could see right away that Russia didn't want to even accept the existence of Ukraine. The second stage, as we call them, but these are really processes. The word stage is not quite right, because it has a kind of linearity to it. And this is not a linear model. The second, though, is symbolization. And examples of that, in fact, also have already been mentioned. Passports were confiscated when 1.3 million Ukrainians were deported to Russia. 19,000 abducted Ukrainian children were adopted and renamed by Russian families. In other words, they literally changed the symbols that identify them as persons. The third stage or process is discrimination. And you can see that in the fact that the Ukrainian officials in conquered cities were immediately fired or killed, and they were replaced by Russians. The fourth stage is dehumanization. Now, that is the stage at which it becomes very clear, and it became clear from the beginning, that this was going to be a genocide, because Vladimir Putin kept saying Ukraine is a Nazi state. And the Russian invasion is necessary to denazify Ukraine. In other words, he was dehumanizing Ukraine to try to call back the Soviet battle against the Nazis in the Second World War. But to call somebody a Nazi is, equivalent to calling them a criminal or a war criminal. Also, he was saying Ukraine was committing genocide against Russians in the Donbass. He considered the Ukrainian language itself to be genocidal because it was replacing Russian. This kind of dehumanization that Putin was using is what we call in genocide studies mirroring. Putin was accusing Ukraine of doing something genocide that he fully intended to do in Ukraine by Russia. In other words, often genocidal powers will hold up a mirror and say they are doing exactly what we intend to do. That's called mirroring, and it's very common in genocide. The fifth stage or process is organization, where you see Putin mobilized the Russian military and Wagner mercenaries to invade Ukraine. He lined them up on the border. And what did we do? NATO warned him not to do it, of course, but did they warn him in a way that Putin would listen to? Did we tell that we would give Ukraine the jets and the missiles to, in fact, to respond to Russia that it needed immediately? No, we did not. We also had the organization of the Russian Orthodox Church supporting Putin's war and the whole Russian propaganda machine. The sixth stage or process is polarization, in which Russia portrayed the war as a, quote, special operation. They didn't even want to call it a war. In fact, if you call it a war, you get arrested. And they arrested Russians who opposed it. The seventh process or stage is preparation. Russia amassed 190,000 troops and war machines right on the border with Ukraine. It was very clear they were going to invade. And then you have persecution. You have the actual invasion, where the first place the Russian troops invaded, they committed massacres. Russian bombs were being dropped on Ukrainian cities. Russia quickly moved into the Donbass to conquer it. In other words, you had persecution from the start. You had the city of Bucha, for instance, just outside of Kyiv, where the Russian troops literally slaughtered the people and they raped the women. Finally, of course, you get extermination, the actual genocide itself, in which the Russian troops murdered, tortured, raped, and destroyed Ukrainians. Russian missiles continue to destroy entire Ukrainian cities. This is called herbicide, in which you literally try to destroy a whole city. That itself is an act of genocide because it's clearly the intent to destroy a part of a national group. And with that extermination, of course, we then had, and throughout this whole process, we had the final process, which is denial. Putin and the Russian propagandists deny all the atrocities by Russia. They say they're all being committed by Ukraine. And opposition political leader Navalny, who opposed the war, was first poisoned. And when that failed, of course, and he survived and he returned, now he has been murdered. Those are the stages, the processes that we saw. And that's why we right away called this genocide. and insisted that the United States and NATO and all of the allies respond to what was clearly going to be and is still a genocide. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that wonderful presentation. I want to now introduce you. So thank you so much for being patient with me and so kind about my technical glitch here. But I'm going to introduce you now. So you all just heard from Dr. Gregory Stanton, who's the founding president of Genocide Watch, the Alliance Against Genocide, and the Cambodian Genocide Project. He was research professor in genocide studies at George Mason University, James Farmer Professor in Human Rights at the University of Mary Washington, and Professor of Law at Washington and Lee, American University, and the University of Swaziland. In the State Department, he drafted the UN resolutions that created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He was a driving force in the creation of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal and drafted its rules of procedure. He was legal advisor to RUKH, the Ukrainian independence movement, as he mentioned, and he helped free Ivan Makar and Stepan Kamara from prison. He spoke at independence rallies in Kiev, as he noted, and he worked with the Rada communities that drafted the post-Soviet Ukrainian constitution. He has degrees from Oberlin College, Harvard Divinity School, Yale Law School, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. So we are so grateful that you are here with us today. And Dr. Stanton, it always amazes me how your imprint is on so many of the sort of important moments in the history of genocide prevention around the world. So thank you so much for being here and for your comments.
You know, Elisa, Ken Roth once told me at a reunion, he said, "You know, you're the Forrest Gump of the human rights movement. You keep turning up where all these people happen. I'm not sure I want to go anywhere you turn up." He said, "These are."
Right. Well, that's fantastic. I don't know if I would call you Forrest Gump, but I see his point. That's very funny. Oh. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Kateryna Rashevska, who is here with us very late at night. So thank you so much for joining us from Ukraine, Kateryna. Kateryna is a lawyer with the Regional Center for Human Rights in Ukraine that Lemkin Institute has had the honor of working with since 2022. She protects the rights of vulnerable categories of victims of international crimes, namely and importantly, children, at the ECHR, the OSCE, the EU, the OCHR, and the ICC. So almost all acronyms, she protects children at them. She is an author of the submissions to the ICC related to international crimes committed against Ukrainian children by Maria Lvova-Belova and by Vladimir Putin. She is also an author and driver of the draft resolution of the UNGA on repatriation of illegally deported children. Together with the team of the Regional Center for Human Rights, Kateryna developed and now advocates the concept of a unified legal mechanism for the return of displaced Ukrainian children. Kateryna Rashevska, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, dear Elisa. You know, for me, it's a huge honor to be here with you. So thank you so much for inviting me. How do you identify genocide when you are experiencing it? Imagine a sudden full-scale invasion of your country, accompanied by atrocities and hate speech, with the aggressor denying the existence of your nation and you personally as its active core. Today, I will attempt to explain how the Regional Center for Human Rights in Ukraine and the Lemkin Institute in the United States since March 2022 have been building a case regarding the genocide against Ukrainian nation. This case was then transferred to the International Criminal Court and led to the issuance of arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova. The Regional Center for Human Rights has been defending human rights for 10 years, seeking justice for victims of international crimes, including deported Ukrainian children, and also countering consequences of the Russian aggression. Since 2018, we have been documented cases of deportation and also illegal adoption of Ukrainian children from the occupied Crimean Peninsula. Therefore, when in February 2022, the Russian Federation began to deport Ukrainian children from the newly occupied territories on a large scale under the pretext of the so-called evacuation, we began to suspect that this was a one-way ticket and that the aggressor state would try to do everything possible to keep these children under the Russian control forever. In April 2022, the first transfer of 27 Ukrainian children from occupied territories to Russian families occurred in the Moscow region. Overall, now the number of transferred children ranges from 380, mentioned, voiced mostly by Maria Lvova-Belova herself, to over 1,000 children, and these criminal acts have been reported in up to 24 regions. The most recent case of forcible transfer of Ukrainian children took place in December 2023, indicating that the Russians have not abandoned their genocidal policy despite the fact that the ICC has issued these arrest warrants. In the expert community, there is no consensus on exactly how to prove genocide in Ukraine. We have several strategies. One of them is the so-called general recognition, so attempting to prove that the Russian Federation war against Ukraine itself has genocidal characteristics. Also, we have a strategy of partial recognition, so trying to prove that war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russians in cities like Bucha, Mariupol, Izium, and others constitute genocide. And finally, we have the strategy of singular recognition, seeking to prove that genocide encompasses the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to the Russian national group. Without jumping into a detailed analysis of the advantages and disadvantages of each strategy, I will simply outline that we, Regional Center for Human Rights, with the support of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, have chosen the last one for ourselves in the ICC. We believe it holds the greatest chance of meeting the highest threshold of proof, as emphasized in the recent decision of the ICJ in the case of Ukraine versus Russia. It was in the case on the third Convention on Eradication of Racial Discrimination. This threshold was indicated very clearly, and interestingly, Ukraine's complaint as for now regarding the Russian Federation's potential violation of the Genocide Convention doesn't enshrine allegations of Russian committing genocide against the Ukrainian national group. Instead, it's a dispute where Russia is now compelled to prove that Ukraine committed genocide in Donbass. Why did Ukraine not amend the complaint? Probably because it realizes that doing so, it could reduce support from an unprecedented number of third parties in this case. It's 32 as of today. Also, it would significantly prolong the judicial period. In past disputes under this convention in the ICJ, it lasted roughly 14-15 years. And of course, it might lead to legal non-recognition of genocide, providing not only Russians, but other aggressors a green light to commit similar acts that fall under other international crimes. So let's go deeper into the elements of the genocidal policy of the Russian Federation concerning the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to the Russian national group. As for material element of such a policy, it's relatively easy to identify. It involves the deportation of and the forcible transfer of at least 19,546 Ukrainian children to 57 regions of the Russian Federation, and also in occupied Crimea, in Belarus, and even in South Ossetia. It's the occupied part of Georgia. Subsequently, these children are forcibly transferred to Russian families or to Russian boarding institutions, and they are all included into the unified database of the Russian Federation of children orphans and children deprived of parental care. It makes them available for adoption by Russian citizens. All these actions, they are accompanied by the imposition of the Russian citizenship, Russification, political indoctrination, and militarization of Ukrainian children, commonly referred to as re-education. The dura specialis of the Russians can be seen from numerous official statements, interviews, media publications, but now even from academic works. In the short term, Russia is interested in using Ukrainian children as a bargaining chip, a means to manipulate Ukraine and compel it to engage in the negotiation. I would like to highlight here that the process of repatriation of Ukrainian children now is like a unique opportunity to Russia to condition something and also to have some ad hoc channel with Ukraine official ad hoc channels through the third party Qatar. So this is about how the Russian Federation is using Ukrainian children like even now. But in the medium term, the objective is to plant the so-called a delay action bomb by indoctrinating Ukrainian children and also stimulating internal conflict in Ukraine, not only through their unsystematic repatriation, but also through the repatriation itself, because these children, they need without any doubt rehabilitation, reintegration, and unfortunately, Ukraine, as for now, doesn't have such programs. So for us, it's really a challenge for our future. On the strategic front, the goal of the Russian Federation is to re-educate Ukrainian children and to turn them into the enemies of Ukrainian nation. And this intent was highlighted by Venezuelan diplomat during the process of drafting the Genocide Convention. So it's like under not only some provisions of the Genocide Convention, but it's also under the spirit of the Genocide Convention. In Russian science, all these policies have already been called as special demographic operation. Therefore, there are chances for establishing genocide in the actions of senior officials of the Russian Federation in the next stages of the proceedings in the ICC at least. Moreover, in addition to requalifying existing arrest warrants, I have already mentioned arrest warrants against Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, we are waiting for new one. And we hope that this decision of the ICC will be very soon. But also we need to support all these judicial proceedings by some political decision at the level, at the regional level, international level, but also at the level of national parliaments. Today, the Council of Europe, also NATO, and the parliaments of several European and North American states, and also the United States, recognize the actions of the Russian Federation in Ukraine as genocide. This political recognition is crucial for mobilizing international community support and its determination to bring the perpetrators to justice. And here I would like just to share with you a good news we have received just several hours ago. Our organization, Regional Center for Human Rights, prepared sanction proposals for some individuals who are directly involved in this process of deportation, also re-education and unreasonable delay in repatriation of Ukrainian children. And today, the European Union, published the list of individuals, and all people we have proposed are now in this sanction list. And that is why for them it's a clear sign that they would be punished in future. And you know, this news has provoked a real stress for Russians. In each channel they have published the news that people who were not in sanction lists during years, for example, Irina Kluyeva, children ombudsman in Crimea, is finally now in the European Union sanction list, and of course she would be included into the sanction list of other states. So Ukraine's case for proving genocide unfortunately could last for decades, we need to be frank. However, holding guilty individuals accountable and ensuring proper legal qualifications can be the most powerful guarantee that such a crime will not be repeated in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kateryna, for that wonderful presentation and insight into how to construct a genocide case for Ukraine. Thank you so much. Now we are going to turn to Dr. Emily Roche, who is a historian of modern Eastern Europe, working on the interconnected histories of architecture and genocide. So very, very interesting topic, and we look forward to your book, Emily, on that. She just completed her PhD, defended last week her PhD at the History Department of Brown University in 2024, and is currently working on a book project related to Jewish architects in Poland before, during, and after the Holocaust. She is also, we're honored, an affiliated scholar at the Lemkin Institute, and is going to share some of her historical insights with us today. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for organizing this really important event. And thank you also to my fellow panelists for sharing your insights. As was mentioned, I'm approaching this topic not from the perspective of a jurist or legal expert looking at the situation from the perspective of the structure of the law today, but I'm a historian, and I was invited to speak a little bit about the 20th century historical context of genocide in Ukraine, and consider how understanding this history and these longer histories can help us identify and respond to the signs of genocide as they're playing out in Ukraine today. So first, I'm going to introduce a bit about my work and explain what I do in terms of methodology and approach. I'm going to provide some very brief historical background on two 20th century genocides that took place in Ukraine, mainly the famine in the early 1930s, known as the Holodomor, and the Holocaust, which is my area of expertise. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about how these contexts and these historical approaches can help us understand and contextualize acts of genocide that Russian forces are perpetuating in Ukraine. So, as Elisa mentioned, in my work, I'm interested in how experiences of war and genocide shape individuals' relationship to the built environment and architecture, particularly in urban areas. And in particular, I'm interested in thinking about how political and social conditions, as well as individual and shared memories, can shape the reconstruction of damaged urban areas in post-war and post-genocidal contexts. Although my work focuses on the city of Warsaw in Poland, I see this as being a topic with international relevance, especially thinking about different urban areas that are under attack today. In terms of methodology, I look at how personal and professional networks function as sites of meaningful political engagement, both for enacting and resisting state policies. In the case of my work, thinking about how architecture was used to build the Polish nation throughout the 20th century. In the context of today's discussion, I'm interested in talking about how both individual biographies and localized narratives can help us understand the ongoing war in Ukraine as a simultaneous attack both on the individual lives, on the people whose lives have been disrupted and affected by the war, on the Ukrainian built environment, specifically thinking about the destruction of cities and built heritage as a kind of attack on the Ukrainian nation and as a form of cultural genocide, as well as an attack on the idea of Ukrainian statehood, which has also been touched upon by my fellow panelists. So I'm going to start with some historical context about these two events that have shaped the discourse when we talk about the current events happening in Ukraine as genocide. The first is the Holodomor, which was a mass famine that took place in Ukraine in the early 1930s, reaching a peak of destruction from 1932 to 1933, and resulting in the deaths of between 3.5 to 7 million ethnic Ukrainians. Although it is a famine, it's important to point out in the context of this event that it was not a natural disaster, and historians typically do not talk about the Holodomor as a famine caused by natural disaster, evidenced by the fact that grain continued to be exported from affected regions as millions died of hunger. And the main scholarly debates over the Holodomor today center on the question of whether or not the famine was an intentional Soviet policy designed to crush Ukrainian resistance to Sovietization, or if it was the product of unsuccessful agricultural policies as they developed in the early Soviet period. And the crux of this debate hinges on an understanding of who was targeted by these planned famines, which were officially related to state efforts at so-called dekulakization, or the destruction of land-owning farmers as a class and not a national group as targeted by genocidal policies. However, as scholars recently have pointed out, most notably Norman Naimark, although others as well, this argument that it was an accidental famine planned to crush a class group obscures the reality of how these categories were applied on the time and how these policies were enacted on the ground, as the category of kulak, of land-owning farmers, was conflated with Ukrainians as a national group, and Ukrainians were targeted by enemies of the people by the Soviet state in the early 1930s. That's far too little time to do this complex event justice, but to move on, the Holocaust is the topic of my research, and I'll say a little bit about that as well. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and by December 1941, all of Ukrainian territory was under German occupation. In the weeks and months following the 1941 invasion, the advance of German troops was frequently accompanied by pogrom violence and attacks on Jewish people in Ukrainian towns and cities. In Lviv alone, which is a large and important city in Western Ukraine, approximately 4,000 Jews were murdered in the first weeks of the German occupation. Most of the Jews living in Ukrainian lands were killed in the so-called Holocaust by bullets. That is, they were rounded up in or near the places where they lived, and they were shot in mass, typically close to their place of residence. They were not deported through camps or ghettos, as was the case, for example, in Poland, in the context that I work on. These massacres were typically carried out by German Einsatzgruppe special units, and they included some of the deadliest acts of mass murder of the Holocaust, including massacres at Babin Yar, which claimed 33,000 victims, and massacres at, for example, Kamieniec-Podolski, in which another 23,000 were killed. Approximately 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews were murdered in the course of the war. So when it comes to the discursive connection between the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust and our recognition of events that are playing out in Ukraine today, one of the most important historical topics that needs to be worked through in this context is the question of local participation in the Holocaust. And it's controversial not only in the Ukrainian context, but also in Poland, in France, and in a variety of kind of scholarly and political contexts considering the memory of the Holocaust. Scholars in recent years have turned to individual first-person accounts of wartime experiences, encapsulating a variety of perspectives in order to make sense of the relationships between Jews and non-Jews during the war. In the Ukrainian context, legacies of wartime collaboration, as well as participation in the Holocaust, have significantly shaped the discourse surrounding the ongoing war. And I'll talk a little bit about this connection as well with regard to thinking about prevention and recognizing genocide. So references to 20th century genocides saturate the political commentary on the actions of Russian forces in Ukraine today. And a major example that has already been discussed is the use of the denazification canard to justify the ongoing violence in Ukraine, as well as the historical use of this trope to justify, for example, the 2014 illegal annexation of Crimea, as well as the invasion of 2 years ago. So this is rhetoric that's not based in any political reality in Ukraine, but it is an approach that appropriates a complex history to legitimize and justify ongoing war crimes and genocide. And I think one of the important things to think about in considering how this historical echo is used to justify genocide is this sort of scale of violence that is alluded to by the idea of denazification. that in a sense, if you say that we're commencing this action as a kind of denazification project, it's a shorthand to justify essentially limitless violence. And this is an echo back as well to the battle between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that remains a core part of Russian national identity and has remained a central part of the justification for this war. This also goes hand in hand with the repeated denial of the legitimacy of Ukrainian statehood, and this is also used for an incitement and justification for genocide in the discursive context of this history. I find this important to point out as well because of the eliminationist nature of this language, and this characterizes it as a signal of genocidal rhetoric, alluding to acts of genocide on a large scale. That is to say that the elimination of statehood or the elimination of the Nazis that are supposedly the justification for this war inheres a kind of eliminationist style of violence, which leads to the genocidal acts that we know are happening in Ukraine. We know that this kind of violence is already occurring, as previous presenters have said, and this rhetoric alludes to the scale of destruction that Russia will continue to perpetrate as long as the war goes on. So to briefly conclude and think about the different ways in which this historical legacy opens possibility for discussing genocide in an open way, in situating today's war in the 100-year-long history of genocidal wars that I have briefly laid out, I think it's important not to imply any kind of inevitability or determinism that suggests that some events invariably lead to genocide or that genocide must continue to happen here because it has already happened in the Ukrainian context. Rather, in my view, history is the accumulation of decisions made over time, and some of these daily decisions appear more or less consequential to us as we look at them in retrospect. But under conditions of genocide, any decision can save or cost a human life. And that leads us to believe that understanding this historical context is crucial to interpreting the choices made by individuals in times of war and genocide. And I believe that a fuller understanding and effort to work through these complex histories can lead to a more effective genocide prevention as well, by serving as an alert for global communities based in historical knowledge. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily, Dr. Roche, for that wonderful historical. You went through so much history in such a short amount of time, so it was very comprehensive, but very short. So bravo to you. Thank you so much for those insights. That's just wonderful. Well, we now have a lot of questions for all of you. I can see them here in our Q&A, and I'm going to hand things over to Lexi Poston, who is a member, as I noted, of Lemkin Institute's executive committee. She's been with us for over 2 years. She's also a PhD student at the Carter School at George Mason University, working on grassroots genocide prevention. So please, Lexi, take it away.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all of our panelists for such insightful and thought-provoking presentations. And as Dr. Forgey said, we have a lot of excellent questions from our attendees. So we're going to start it off with a question for all of our panelists. Why were these signs of genocide seen from the onset, yet Putin was allowed to go ahead with this senseless war on European soil upon all places? Do you all think Putin will ever be punished for these crimes?
What a good question.
That's a great question, and it's sort of 2 questions. So I'm just going to open it up to our panelists, and you can answer both or one of those questions. Dr. Stanton, let's start with you.
Sure. Having worked in the State Department, I can give you a rough answer of why we didn't respond as well as we should have. I think there's a default position in most, well, depends on who's in charge. I know who's president and so forth, but the default position is to avoid war. And because war is so terrible. I remember when my son, who was a U.S. Marine, came back from Iraq, And I asked him, what's your conclusion? He said, Dad, he said, war is the worst of all possible solutions. And that is certainly true. But the problem is when you're confronted with a dictator like Hitler, or like, in this case, Putin, and they are insistent on being aggressors against another nation, sometimes you have to respond with force. And the problem was we didn't want to get our own troops involved in the Ukrainian war, nor did Europe, the European Union or NATO. And so that's why they were so, we have been, I think, so tepid in our support for Ukraine. We have not given Ukraine enough support and didn't do it fast enough. I think if Putin had realized that if he marched his troops across the border into Ukraine, that they would be immediately attacked with F-16s, missiles, and everything else that was supplied by NATO to Ukraine. It wouldn't have to be, in fact, launched from NATO states. But nevertheless, they'd be immediately attacked by the full force of NATO. I don't know whether he would have invaded. In other words, sometimes these dictators have to be, really threatened with real consequences of what they're doing. And I don't think Putin thought he would be. He was sure he would succeed in just a few weeks or even a couple months to conquer all of Ukraine. He had the illusion, because of his illusion about Ukraine really still being part of Russia, that Ukrainians would just give in and, become Russians again. Well, that was, of course, a big false assumption. Ukrainians have fought back with all of the vigor that I knew Ukrainians would have. But I think that is why we didn't respond fast enough. The second question, will there be a way for Putin to be tried? I doubt it. The reason is, in order to try him, you have to arrest him. And because our International Criminal Court, for instance, does not do cases in absentia. And I think really the only thing that could possibly bring him to justice is if he's overthrown from within and then turned over, the way Milosevic was in the case of the war in Bosnia and former Yugoslavia. That might happen. There are some Russians, I think, high up enough perhaps to overthrow him. But at this point, I'm not betting on that, just looking at what happened to Navalny. Putin is a murderer, a mass murderer, and mass murderers don't stop. They just keep murdering.
Yeah, thank you. I know Kateryna also wants to answer that, but Greg, I think that's such an important answer that you're giving to both questions, and I often wonder if we had better mechanisms that were institutionalized at an international level for recognizing genocidal dimensions in ideology before conflict breaks out. Would we be better at responding to the threat posed by Putin on February 22nd, 2022, or February 23rd, 2022, or even in 2014? So you're calling for sort of a faster, a stronger response from the Western nations, which I also agree with, because we know that genocide doesn't stop itself. Once it's started, it's almost impossible to stop without, massive loss of life or military engagement. But the idea of responding quickly and forcefully sometimes can have the effect of these dictators and these genocidaires backing down or thinking twice about what they're planning to do, or resolving at least the military problem, the conflict problem earlier on. So I think it's very important what you're saying. And it points to, although people were quick to recognize genocide, maybe it wasn't fast enough, right, at the level it needed to be at. So I don't know if you want to respond to that as well, and then we'll hear from Kateryna.
In fact, Genocide Watch has been advocating for years that Article 14 of the statute of the International Criminal Court be employed more often, in which member states of the ICC can ask the prosecutor to investigate and to, in fact, bring charges against people who are committing crimes or, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so forth. We also have been advocating creation of an ICC police force that would actually have the power to arrest people who are indicted or charged. The word is not indicted at the ICC, it's charged, but who are charged by the ICC with committing these crimes. The ICC, of course, is got this paralysis because theoretically, countries that aren't part of under the jurisdiction of the ICC, who haven't ratified its statute, for instance, are sort of immune from, the charges being lodged. The Security Council is supposed to be able to overrule that by giving the ICC jurisdiction. I'd like to see that change too, where the ICC does have the power to, in fact, not just wait for the Security Council to act, but in fact would be able to indict or charge, and then have a police force that would be responsible for trying to arrest the people who are doing these things. And I would agree with you. I think we need to do it before the major genocide is underway. A lot of times when you wait too long, it's just too late. That was one of the things I learned from Martin Luther King. He said there is such a thing as just being too late.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Yeah, Kateryna, please.
I would like just highlight that unfortunately during 8 years before the large-scale invasion, the problem was not only some not so fast or maybe not good enough and efficient answer. The problem was no answer. Our organization was established in 2013, and since 2014, we have documented war crimes and crimes against humanity in occupied Crimea. We submitted like more than 10 communications, like our 3 communications with the Lemkin Institute to the ICC, and all we had was some recognitions of elements of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the final report. As for preliminary investigation in Ukraine, this preliminary report dated on 2020. So it was all answer, but during all these 8 years, the world was carrying out the policy of appeasement. This was the problem, and also the problem was that sometimes, even despite some like sanctions, 10 countries of Europe continued transferring to Russia weapons. And now this weapon is launched against Ukrainian civilian population, in different cities. So we need to be frank. It was like some consensus towards Putin not to tell many things about war crimes and crimes against humanity in Crimea. And even after the large-scale invasion, for example, the same case with deportation and adoption of children, but in Crimea. So Russians voiced it in the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, like February this year. So it was several weeks ago. But there is nothing about these children in the concluding observations. So these children, they are just lost forever in Russia, in Russian foster families, without any accountability for these Russians, and also without any possibility to be repatriated, because, of course, during the process of adoption, their new parents have changed everything, name, date of birth, place of birth, and so on and so forth. So, and even this compensation mechanism elaborated at the international level. So all damages are since 2022 But what about violations and international crimes before, during 8 years? So maybe we need to like to take it into account, and maybe to propose something else for Ukrainians in other occupied territories, because even after the occupation, it may provoke some internal tensions between different survivors of the same crimes.
Wow, I mean, that's really such an important point. That the world missed all of the signs for so long, and is now reaping the consequences of that. And I think that you're really pointing, Kateryna, to the need for a more nuanced, a better, and a stronger international mechanism for recognizing genocidal threats. And for also recognizing that when those threats are made, one cannot ignore them. You cannot work with appeasement when you're dealing with a genocidal entity, whether that's a state entity or a non-state entity. Appeasement in the long term won't work and can set the stage for impunity and greater loss of life and destruction of identity and cultural heritage. So I think that's a really important point, and it dovetails nicely with what Dr. Roche, what Emily was talking about, the need for historical understanding. I often wonder if, and Greg, I think you were attuned to this, but if the genocide scholar community had been more attentive to Russia's way of war in Chechnya or in Syria, there were certainly enough red flags in those conflicts to suggest exactly what would happen in Ukraine, but even worse because of Russia's special historical relationship with Ukraine and the fact that Russia has committed genocide in Ukraine already in the 1930s, but then, as Kateryna's pointing out, again, starting in 2014. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, or if we should move on to the next question. Greg, please.
Yeah, and in fact, it's not just one-sided either. You're right. Russia's way of war is really brutal and has been over in the past, so we shouldn't be surprised. You're right. But America's way of war has been brutal too. I mean, if you look at what we did in Vietnam, for instance, and then you look at what we did in Iraq or Afghanistan,
Yeah.
there are real parallels there. We should learn from those experiences. War itself is brutal. War is terrible. It's horrible. And so we have to learn how to avoid it somehow. And we should learn from previous experience. In this case, I not sure that America has learned it yet. So it's not just Russia, of course, but it is very instructive to look at the past and to look at, in fact, the history of the Soviet Union. So you're right to make sure that, and the Holodomor is, I mean, it's a really good predictor of what Russia might do here in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, since Russia never recognized the full extent of its responsibility for the Holodomor, or, the issues that Dr. Roche was pointing out about intentionality and the types of categories, that fall, I think one can make a case underneath the Genocide Convention. This notion of kulak was a capacious notion, right? And it included the Ukrainian nation as such, simply because it's a class or an economic category doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't fall in the Genocide Convention, but there was never, and we know from scholarship that societies, Greg, you always remind me of this, societies that have not recognized and worked to account for mass atrocity in the past are 3 times as more likely to commit them in the present and future. And that goes, of course, for the United States as well. So yes, I think that's a really important corrective you're offering there. In this panel, we're not simply talking, we are talking about Russia. That's the Russia and Ukraine are the subject matter of this panel. But of course, the idea is to universalize the lessons, and you just did that for us so well. Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much. And Emily, do you have something you'd like to say to this discussion from this question?
Sure. I'm interested in responding again, kind of bringing up this idea of to what extent the Holodomor, kind of the memory and the understanding of past genocides can influence the way we think about prevention and response today. And to some extent, I would push back against a strictly linear perspective saying that because the Soviet state under Stalin committed this genocide 90 years ago, that means Putin is kind of destined to repeat these steps because of all of the contingency and all of the individual choices that are required to carry out a genocide today, while thinking about the ways that this rhetoric and this discourse, of course, repeats itself, and the significance of the discourse of the 1930s and 40s as it plays out in justification today. But thinking about specifically this class of kulaks and how these categories were sort of invented in a way and targeted in such a way to avoid outright saying, we're targeting these rural Ukrainian groups, we're not, we're targeting kulaks, to enemies of the people, this is the Soviet Union, and this is, what the state building looks like. I'm curious also to hear Dr. Stanton and Kateryna and any of, as well as Elisa, Dr. Joeden-Forgey, if you have any thoughts of this idea, to what extent the kind of the categorization of genocide sometimes can hinder or prohibit intervention. If there's an idea of course, the 1930s, thinking about the Holodomor, this is before the notion of genocide was kind of widely used in law prevention, and this idea at that time didn't exist. But today, to think, well, is this a protected category? Does this qualify as genocide, or is it just a different kind of mass murder? And how does this categorization sometimes limit and sometimes support prevention and intervention efforts?
That's a great question. I'm going to hand that over to Greg and Kateryna. I have many thoughts on that, and we often discuss them. But Greg, please.
Sure, I think that's a wonderful point, Emily, because, in fact, I've read this book on caste, for instance. And one of the things that the author makes, one of the points she makes, is that dehumanization is done against a group. It is not something you do against an individual. And then after you've done it to a group, then the individuals who are members of that group can also be dehumanized much more easily. Groups are, kind of amorphous masses of people. And it's quite possible to have all kinds of fictitious, dehumanization of such groups. So when you dehumanize the kulaks as class enemies, for instance, you dehumanize a huge number of people, and then that allows you to dehumanize all these individuals who happen to be, well, part of that classification, part of that group. In fact, that's been one of the arguments used by deniers to say, oh no, the Holodomor wasn't a genocide. After all, it was just, class, the usual class warfare that you found in immediately communist states, which of course is not true. I mean, the truth was, it was also against the Ukrainian people. It was against the national group. But the point is, the deniers say, oh, no, it was against an economic group, which isn't included in the Genocide Convention. By the way, the reason the Soviet Union did not want economic groups, social groups, and cultural groups included in the Genocide Convention was precisely they knew if those were included, they'd be guilty as hell. Yeah. And so, and it wasn't just the Soviet Union either, by the way. It was colonial powers who didn't want that in the convention. Lemkin did. Raphael Lemkin wanted those things in the Genocide Convention and cultural groups as well. I believe Lemkin was right. In fact, at Genocide Watch, we do use Lemkin's definition of genocide, which is broader than the Genocide Convention itself. But you're right about the categorization, because if you're allowed to, say, oh, no, we're not trying to target a whole national group or a whole ethnic group or racial or religious group, no, it's just these people. That is a great tactic of deniers, of denial. So you're absolutely right. Of course, one of the things we strongly believe in this whole anti-genocide movement is that kind of division of people is one of the reasons for genocide.
That's yes, absolutely. I have very little to add to that. I just want to add that, with these constructed categories in the convention, they do leave too much room for perpetrators to argue their way out of genocide simply by claiming they're not targeting these 4 protected categories. For those of you who don't know what those are national, ethnic, racial, and religious groups. And they were, as Greg is pointing out, it's a political document, it's a treaty. The convention is a treaty, and certain things were left out because the great powers at the United Nations at the time didn't want them in. Now, the convention is what is used in courts of law. So we have to continue to push for case law that pushes against the 4 categories. I think I like Scott Strauss's notion of the categories that are used, which is organic, collective. There is usually some sort of sensibility within the minds of genocidaires that their target group is self-reproducing, right? So that group may self-reproduce biologically by having children. It may self-reproduce culturally, as political groups or social groups often self-reproduce. But there is that kind of organic notion that these people have to be rooted out the way you would a plant. So that kind of biological and organic essentialism exists even for class, social, and cultural groups that are being targeted, that may not be, and political groups that may not be mentioned by the convention. And then I also like Daniel Feierstein's point about this. He's an Argentine scholar of genocide, which is, we have very few laws that discriminate within the law, and naming 4 protected categories is a discriminatory legal intervention, right? So it suggests that there are certain people who are more worthy of protection than others from this type of mass crime. So as Greg's pointing out, in prevention, we rarely use the 4 protected categories because we're aware how creative human beings are and how much our discourse and language and social constructions change over time. And in fact, as Greg mentioned, that is something that interested Raphael Lemkin greatly, was the way in which those things shift and the many techniques that human beings find to destroy each other as groups in whole or in part. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I love that discussion you started, Emily.
I think you're really right. To pick up on that, the ICTR made 2 really big contributions, steps forward in genocide law, when it decided that groups were in the mind of the perpetrator. In other words, that you didn't have to have an objective definition of what is an ethnic group or a national group or whatever. That was in the mind of the perpetrator that you saw that there was a national group or an ethnic group or a racial or religious group. That was a big step forward. So that was a subjective test, is what lawyers call that. The second big step forward is when they concluded, rightly, I think, in the Akiyesu case, that mass rape is an act of genocide. That, even though it doesn't mention gender or sex in the Genocide Convention, that mass rape itself is an act of genocide because it is an attempt, in fact, it's carrying out an attempt to destroy part of the group. Very clear, it is, of course. And it's usually even said so. I mean, when they did the study in Darfur, for instance, the rapists would say things to the women they were raping, like, now you'll have a lighter skinned child. things of that sort that are very clearly genocidal intent. So yes, I think the ICTR, in other words, really advanced the law of genocide in that way. They also, by the way, advanced it beyond where the World Court has. The ICTR realized that intent wasn't just something that you could, conclude from something somebody said. You can conclude it from a systematic pattern of actions, and it's like concluding from somebody's picking up a gun and shooting it and killing someone else, that they've had the intent to commit murder. But the ICJ's opinion on intent in its Bosnia case and its Croatia case is that state intent has to be the only intent of the state. Well, that's crazy. In an ordinary criminal court, if you use that kind of test of intent, you'd have to say that that guy who picked up the gun and shot somebody and killed him couldn't be tried for murder because he also had the intent to rob the person. Now, that can't be right. In other words, you can't have a single intent theory of intent. The ICJ's got to change that, or else Myanmar is going to lose. Gambia is going to lose its case against Myanmar, which clearly had more than one intent. Similarly, we'll have, other cases where the ICJ will find that there isn't adequate proof of intent. By the way, and this is something I can say, I think with some confidence, because the ICJ has this strange view of state intent, the single intent theory or the only intent theory, I think Israel is going to get off the hook in the South Africa case against Israel, because the ICJ is going to find that Israel doesn't have just this one intent, namely to commit genocide. But Genocide Watch and Lemkin Institute and a lot of other genocide scholars believe Israel is, in fact, committing genocide in Gaza. And we also, of course, think that Hamas committed genocide against Israelis. We think it's a double genocide. We know that Israel has existential reasons for its attacks. We have it all kinds of, after the Holocaust and so forth, we know all kinds of justifications. But the question we have is there ever a justification for genocide? I don't think so.
Me neither. Thank you, Greg. Me neither. I agree with you. Kateryna, please.
So as Dr. already mentioned, the practice of the to highlight that in the case on rough prevention, the problem also because some violations, of course, violations of international human rights law, they were committed against like ethnic group, but against political group, against people who are unloyal to Russia and discriminated because they don't want to have Putin as their president and Russia as their homeland in Crimea. So it was all a problem, and of course there is one of the reasons why in
Kateryna, can you stop for one moment? We're not here. You're coming in and out, and we really want to hear your answer. So I'm wondering, would you turn off your video for a moment? I think that might help with the audio, and then come back and then start over, please. So sorry.
It's okay. So it was about this case with racial discrimination and about like the problem is that it was sometimes really difficult to prove that this discrimination was caused because of ethnicity of these groups and Crimean Tatar and Ukrainians, and not because they were just unloyal to the Russian Federation and to President Putin. And we face the same with genocidal case case, because unfortunately it's not really easy to prove sometimes that these people are killed, these people are raped because they're Ukrainians and from Ukrainian ethnical group or from Ukrainian national group. But in our case, as for deported children, it's little a bit easier. And in our communication to the ICC, we have decided that this is attack against the Ukrainian national group, and this national group is defined by the factor of Ukrainian citizenship. So these children are Ukrainian citizens, even if they don't have Ukrainian documents, and that is why Russia, by transferring them to the Russian national group, is trying to eradicate partially Ukrainian national group. So with the children case, it's little a bit easier. However, I am sure that at the some stage of the investigation, we will also face some challenges where for some children from territories occupied for 10 years, it would be not easy to prove that they are really from Ukrainian national group, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to win a genocide case. We know that in a court of law, but that does not mean that genocide did not happen or is not happening. So we have to remember that it's not just a legal term. It is a legal term, but it's not just a legal term. Great, so we have a bunch of questions here and 10 minutes left. So Lexi, I'm gonna hand it back over to you. Sorry for shanghaiing the the symposium with all of these subsidiary questions, but that was a great initial question. It really brought out a lot of discussion. Please.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that kind of all go together.
Thank you.
So first, what has resistance looked like in Russia? More specifically, how are everyday people opposing Putin's genocidal policies? And what successes have they had given the constant threat of persecution for resisting? And how can the US and European powers actively engage in preventing genocide and defending the victims? So how do we prevent current and future genocides going forward? And what roles can actors at different levels play to stop the genocide in Ukraine or any other genocides?
Please, whoever wants to start an answer. Kateryna.
I would like to start with the second question, the assistance of the United States, not only United States, but also.
Oh, Kateryna, I'm so sorry. You're going in and out again. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I understood. So as for this assistance, they are requesting to sanction Russians, to continue this sanction pressure, also to continue to help Ukraine with weapon. Unfortunately, I am a human rights lawyer, but I need to ask you, because without it, it's really impossible to win Russia on the battlefield. And if Russia continues this policy of occupation of Ukrainian territories, more people, more civilians will suffer because of its atrocities. We need to understand that Bucha, Izium, Mariupol will be repeated in different other cities of Ukraine. This is really important for us, but also to qualify properly, to not only to recognize politically that it is genocide, but also to open criminal investigations. We have this principle of universal jurisdiction. Please do something, at least when we are talking about deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children. There are clear cases where even Russian high-ranking officials, they really adopted Ukrainian children with changing personal data. I am talking about Sergei Mironov and Margarita Prokopenko from Kherson region. Please start some, if not investigation, because I understand that maybe it's not under universal jurisdiction as for now, but at least to name it properly and to demonstrate your determination to do something with it in future. And as for people like who are against Russians in occupied territories, we need to understand that these people are under the constant threat. They are mobilized by Russian armed forces. These people are victims of imposition of the Russian citizenship. They are victims of discriminatory persecution. They are victims of eradication of Ukrainian national identity. We are waiting for another cycle of war crimes and crimes against humanity before and during new elections of President Putin in occupied territories, because of course many people would be against and would not be able to vote for president in occupied territories, but they would be forced. Some people who are against Russian citizenship, they are now deported from the occupied territories. They are expelled. Some of them, they are detained because of some like political motivated proceedings, like terrorism or extremism and so on, just because they are unloyal. So people are trying to fight against Russia, but unfortunately Russia, with all this machine of persecution and atrocities, now is unfortunately is able to carry out this policy and to commit more and more crimes.
Thank you, Kateryna. Thank you so much.
I would have two answers. One for Russian resistors, which is that nonviolent resistance is the only way to overthrow a government like Putin's. It is not possible to do it violently. It is a sure bet that Putin will have more violence on his side. So you have to adopt nonviolent resistance. The other thing I would say is this is for the NATO countries and for other countries, give the Ukrainians enough weapons to actually strike back, to actually destroy the places where the missiles are coming from inside Russia. I mean, this is crazy that we were giving Ukraine, these little amounts of weapons at the beginning, not allowing them to have F-16s, not allowing them to have missiles and so forth, and then telling them you can't strike inside Russia where the missiles are being sent from to destroy your cities. That's crazy. It's allowing allowing a safe area for the Russians to attack from. And I don't advocate, of course, I don't advocate bombing Russian cities or trying to kill Russian civilians. No, I think what we need to do is try to destroy those missile bases and the places from which the bombers are coming and so forth inside Russia. So Putin will know that he can't just get away with this. We're going to destroy his military capability. And it's not we, by the way. That's important to remember. Ukrainians are quite capable of defending themselves if they have the right weapons.
Excellent point. Emily.
Sure. So I'll add just a little bit of context. I think that so many important things have already been said on the point of these two questions, but thinking about Russian resistance, I think it can possibly be helpful to also re-emphasize the fact that Russia is a huge country and not a monolith. And there are many other kinds of human rights abuses that are being perpetrated by the Russian government as well. And I wonder how productive it can be to think of the different kinds of resistance movements taking place within the broader context of Russian political and social circumstances now. I'm thinking of, for example, the recent reinvigorated attacks against LGBT populations in Russia. Russia has historically also committed genocide against other neighboring countries, of whom many live in minority communities within the Russian Federation, including Kazakh minority members in Russia and Koreans, ethnic Koreans in Russia as well. And so I think in reimagining the sphere of Russian resistance as something that revolves around various points of gravity and that has various concerns to address can maybe help bring into view a clearer picture, really, of what's at stake, that there's so much context to be viewed here, with Ukraine being the reason why we're gathered here today. And I think one of the most talked about issues regarding the Russian political oppression and what the Russian state has done. And then with regards to what can be done with NATO members and the United States, one thing that I'm always encouraging, that I have less of a suggestion regarding a legal approach or a statist approach, but to take into consideration, read Ukrainian publications, read what Ukrainians are saying, read what people from your part of the political spectrum in Poland and Lithuania, and really try to internalize what the demands are and what the stakes are, and to spread that information. And so I think that as an educator, that's something that I have been trying to internalize and to kind of shift my own views in the way I think about this conflict and the way I think about the ongoing genocide, by reinforcing what's at stake and having a broader perspective.
Excellent point. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you. So we have time for a few. Oh, no, we don't. We're almost out. Lexi, is there one last question we should ask before we go?
Yes, there is one that is a great way to just wrap up today's webinar, and it's for Dr. Stanton, but any of our panelists are welcome to answer. Should the ICC have jurisdiction over the United States?
Absolutely. We should become a party to the ICC statute. It's incredible that we aren't, you know? I mean, I remember debating this very question with a person who was a National Security Council advisor under President Trump, John Bolton. This is when the ICC statute first came out. And I was co-chair of the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court. And they invited us down to Duke to have a debate about whether the U.S. Should become a state party to the ICC statute. And I had worked with Dave Sheffer and others on this, statute, and I knew how, it was very well thought through. Anyway, when he would make criticisms about the ICC and, oh my gosh, our American servicemen are going to get pulled in front of this thing, and it's illegitimate, it's a violation of our sovereignty and all that, I say you're wrong. Article 92 takes care of that. If we have courts that can prosecute our servicemen when they commit crimes, then the ICC won't have jurisdiction. In other words, John Bolton didn't know the statute. And after the debate, frankly, people came up to me and said, you cleaned his clock. Because, a lot of people are just ignorant about the ICC statute. It's a very well thought through statute. And of course, we should become part of it. Of course, we should be cooperating with it. It's for the rule of law, and we should be for the rule of law.
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful answer. And I want to give our last comment to Kateryna. And you can comment on that question, but I'd also like you to tell everyone who's here today for this event what message you would like them to give, right, to their friends, to their family, to their colleagues, to people they encounter on a day-to-day basis about what's going on in Ukraine and how we can all help.
So first of all, I would like to add to Dr. Stanton that not only United States but also Ukraine needs to ratify Rome Statute and to become party of this institution, not only user, without some rights, but with all obligations. But as for my message, please continue support Ukraine. If there will be some fatigue, for us it's a question of our existence. So we need your support, and of course, without United States, we can't survive. And that is why we need everything, not only economic support, not only military support, but also informational support. Please not only read our articles, but also as academic society, write your own academic articles. Please fight against Russian propaganda in the academic sphere. We need to fight Russian propaganda in media. Please share only news from Ukrainian verified media. Please be as responsible as possible, not only for Ukrainian case, but also for all other nations who are now suffering because of the genocide. Ukraine is not unique, and it will not be frank to compare sufferings of people. And that is why we would like just to save ourselves in order to then protect others. So please be with us, and this is the most important thing for us.
What a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much, Kateryna. And let us all continue to work in solidarity with threatened communities. That was a beautiful statement of solidarity, Kateryna. Ukrainian solidarity with people suffering similar types of crimes all over the world. We have to end this terrible, terrible crime of genocide. It's a human crime. Human beings do it. Human beings can end it. I hope you have enjoyed our discussion today. We will have many more of these. If you would like another discussion on Ukraine, if you would like us to bring back our team here today, please email us at info@lemkininstitute.com. Let us know, and we will bring everybody back, provided they will give us their time again, and we can have a follow-up meeting about today's discussion. I have learned so much from all of you. Cannot thank you enough. Thank you all.
Kateryna.
Slava Ukraina!
Героям слава!
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye to everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.